The Democratic Party is filled with hubris, selfishness, careerism, and conceitedness. And I know that we've all known this about the Democratic Party, but after what's come out just this week, I'm not sure they're going to make it out of this one. So we're getting around that time to where the bombshell books are coming out. And you have to understand that this is a thing that happens pretty much all the time during an administration just beginning or after an administration just ending, where people who call themselves journalists will save some of their bigger scoops, their bigger information, until a little bit later where they can release a book, maybe get a New York Times bestseller, maybe go on a book tour, maybe go on some speaking events. Basically, they use the opportunity to level up their own sort of career, these journalists do. Instead of giving people the information that, you know, we as a semi-informed public would have liked to know beforehand. And there's a lot of reasons why that information can get delayed. I think it's easiest to look at the purely career reasons. I think back at Michael Wolff. He was famous for the Fire and Fury book that came out early in Trump's first term. That was kind of describing the chaos and the misunderstandings that were going on within the White House that Trump was causing, the sort of quote unquote unorthodox way that he was leading. To the extent that they were quote unquote bombshells or big news that we actually didn't know beforehand, a lot of this was being reported in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and a lot of other, you know, reputable for this sort of stuff news outlets, the kinds that focus on Washington D.C. and the inner machinations, the kinds who have the sources to be able to understand what's going on inside of a White House, even beyond what the press people within that White House would want the public to know. And that dynamic of press people hiding information from the public or from journalists only to give them covert information afterwards is kind of an annoying part, but that's not the point here. Now it's Joe Biden's turn on the hot seat from all these books. So you have two books that have come out. Original Sin by Jake Tapper from CNN and Alex Thompson. And you also have Uncharted by Chris Whipple. And both of these books try to look into what Trump did right, what Biden and Harris did wrong, and some of the underlying stories that were, you know, if you're paying attention to politics, if you're watching like my channel or a lot of other channels that were keeping up on this, especially to the left of the Democratic Party, these were things we already sort of knew. These were examples that we had heard little articles of. But I mean, you didn't have to be a political nerd. Like, Joe Biden was stumbling over himself physically. He was unable to pronounce words. They were keeping him away from doing campaign events and speeches at a time when he was running for office as a re-election and for his presumably second term. But one of those bombshells actually comes right here from an Axios article that Alex Thompson from Axios, of course, premieres because it's in his book. And now you start to see how this gets to be very self-serving. But Biden aides discussed whether he would be in a wheelchair if he were reelected. The issue being basically that Biden's physical deterioration, most apparent in his halting walk, had become so severe that there were internal discussions about putting the president on the wheelchair, but they couldn't do so until after the election. There's apparently someone that had said Biden's physician said that his spine was in such bad condition, as I'm pointing out right here, that if he were to fall one more time, he would be wheelchair bound for the rest of his life. Again, these are things that aren't incredibly new. Like, if you just had eyes and were watching Joe Biden during this time, you'd know that, oh, he doesn't really look like he's got his sea legs under him quite completely. And that's completely understandable if you're in your 80s. But if you have a high profile, high energy job, as such as being the president needs to be, it's not a good look in public. It's not a good look. It doesn't do anything to show towards not just physical health, but mental health. When you're hearing from someone who is stubborn and very old term styles of politics, like when it comes to foreign policy, when you hear someone who is stubborn about their own ability to enter into debate environments or interview environments, when you have to have surrogates who are speaking out for Joe Biden, saying that, no, don't worry, it's okay. He's actually really, really good at making decisions when the public isn't watching him and he's behind the scenes. And I'll give a quote to, you know, he's right twice a day, but like Ezra Klein, who at the time stuck his neck out and was one of the few people in traditional media at the New York Times who was calling for Biden to drop out of the race as early as December, January 2024. He got a lot of heat from that. The Biden administration gave him a lot of heat. A bunch of these other entities gave him a lot of heat. And it turned out that Biden ultimately did need to drop out of the race once his inability to act during the debate became so apparent and so much of a political football for him. The recount has even more brutal stuff. They have a post from, they did a post kind of summarizing some of these things. And David Plouffe, who was one of the, Democratic strategists, if I have that correctly. Yeah, he was a Democratic Party strategist. He said that Biden's decision to, keep moving on in the second term or like for second term, quote, totally fucked us, end quote. So you had people who were in there who were really upset. And people who were just like disagreeing with the strategy. There's a moment during debate prep with Ron Klain, who was like a big debate prep person within the Democratic Party, has worked with a number of high up officials. He counts in this article here. Says Biden, who still felt ill, had an idea. If he looked perplexed when Trump talked, voters would understand that Trump was an idiot. This was Biden's idea. Ron Klain replied, "Sir, when you look perplexed, people just think you're perplexed. And this is our problem in this race." So Joe Biden has always had this issue, even when he was more of right mind and in more health. When he was when he was Obama's vice president. And this is one of the things against him. He's a gaffe machine. He often talks too much, and things that come out of his mouth are not just not politically correct, but are sometimes superseding what the administration wants and what the Democratic Party wants. And sometimes this has worked out. We basically got whatever rights for marriage equality in this country because of a gaffe Joe Biden made. Because Joe Biden said, yeah, he's okay with gay marriage, even before Obama had said it publicly. And so that kind of forced Obama and the Democratic Party to rush that out, because once Joe Biden said it, it was a good idea, right? Joe Biden's healthcare Obamacare getting it passed is a big fucking deal. Like those moments, those are Biden's better off the cuff moments. Most of them not. I remember when he was introduced as Barack Obama's running mate in 2007 or 2008 most likely, and Joe Biden was introducing Obama, and he was kind of introducing himself as the vice president, and he introduced Obama by saying, quote,
"A man I'm proud to call my friend, a man who will be the next president of the United States, Barack America."
This was Joe when he had most of his marbles, so to speak. Like, it's only gotten worse. So this sort of, I'm going to look perplexed and that's going to be good. Even the Democratic strategists who were just like, yes, let me kiss your ass. Yes, go ahead. They were like, no, this is too much for me. There's even more bombshells. There's even more quotes I got to get through to here. I don't really care too much about the George Clooney thing. Apparently, there had been a fundraiser where Joe Biden didn't even recognize who George Clooney is. I am bad at recognizing celebrities and things like that. Of course, as a president, you're not supposed to do that. As a politician, you're not supposed to do that. And if you are someone who is seen as a, figure who might be losing their memory, that's not the best look to have. And that's how George Clooney ended up writing an op-ed that's happened to be perfectly timed with Joe Biden's debate performance, his bad debate performance in June of 2024, that added to calls for Biden to step aside. Of course, as we later would know, that even those calls were too little too late. Apparently in May, there was a fundraiser in Los Angeles where Obama had to lead Joe Biden off the stage because he had one of those like Mitch McConnell frozen in space, like Windows.exe has stopped responding, like Biden.exe has stopped responding. He had one of those moments, and he was just staring into the crowd before Obama leapt into action, kind of like, guided old man Joe down the stairs. It just gets worse after worse after worse. And you hear this from the Biden senior aides, and you can tell this really doesn't and didn't help, which I think kind of goes into many of the issues that are happening here. One of the aides says, quote, We attempted to shield him from his own staff, so many people didn't realize the extent of the decline beginning in 2023. This is quoting the staffer again. I love Joe Biden. When it comes to decency, there are few in politics like him. Still, it was a disservice to the country and to the party for his family and advisors to allow him to run again. I think that's really interesting because we've seen a lot about how Joe Biden is kind of on his legacy tour, trying to refix the legacy after losing in 2024, naturally. How many years this past couple months have been. But yeah, there's been a lot to say about how Jill Biden has played a role. Maybe even Hunter Biden has played a little bit of a role in trying to keep, to motivate Joe Biden, that patriarch of the family, to continue going and to not listen to the naysayers, because what do the naysayers have on their side? Facts, examples, and their own fucking eyes. And I think that, like, as we get through to this, we're seeing some of the backlash that the Biden team is already having here. A Biden spokesperson responded to the claims in the original Sin book, writing in part, quote, "We are still waiting for anyone, to point out where Joe Biden had to make a presidential decision or make a presidential address where he was unable to do his job because of mental decline. In fact, the evidence points to the opposite. He was a very effective president." I mean, I have one word to counter against the idea where Joe Biden had to make a presidential decision or he was unable to do his job because of mental decline. That word's Gaza, for sure. I think we all agree that even Trump, as we're seeing, who has no love or admiration for the Palestinian people. He has used Palestinian as a slur to describe white American Jewish politicians. But even Donald Trump, in recent talks with Hamas, Hamas has sort of the idea that Donald Trump is easier to negotiate with and willing to make some sort of ceasefire deal more serious than Joe Biden was. And there's hinting that we're understanding that Benjamin Netanyahu felt that he could walk all over Joe Biden, but that Donald Trump was actually a tougher, deal maker, and would actually, be more unpredictable when it came to what he wanted and what his goals were. And so that could have been something that helped that, so-called ceasefire that happened for like 2.5 minutes during the very first part of Trump's term, before Trump basically gave Netanyahu the go-ahead to continue not just the slaughtering that had happened since October 7th, 2023, under Joe Biden's watch and assistance, but to continue it and to move towards a stage of in public colonization. Before, we knew it was like colonization behind the scenes. They wouldn't say it, or they would say it on hot mic, or they'd be quoted as such. Now they're just saying the quiet part out loud, and by saying it, they're screaming it. You still get a Democratic Party in denial, and I think that Norman Solomon, in a great article for The Nation, put a good point here, noting that the careerism that enabled Biden's re-election run still poisons the Democratic Party. And this is so important. This is so crucial, because the issue with Joe Biden being allowed to run in his election the way he did is the same way that Bernie Sanders was eschewed in favor of Joe Biden in 2020 and Hillary Clinton in 2016. It's sort of this idea that Kamala Harris, who I think is a more adept politician than Joe Biden, but that isn't really saying much, not only had her own issues and her own problems, but she seemed to have her own way about running the presidency and the presidential race the first couple of days and weeks, when she was like kind of getting her sea legs and getting her bearings. It seems like she had a different path for the Democratic Party that she wanted to try to flex and work out. Tim Walz has basically confirmed as much, that once Joe Biden's team started taking over the run of the presidential election for Kamala Harris, because Joe Biden's team was the team that Kamala Harris inherited once she became the nominee. But that Biden team held her back. They said, "Oh, tell Tim Walz to stop calling the Republicans weird, because that's not working." It was working very well. Stay to Joe Biden's agenda, especially when it comes to foreign policy. I think Biden said during the debate, like, make sure there's no daylight in between you and I when it comes to policy. Because for Biden, this wasn't about winning an election, or perhaps he had the hubris that the election was easily winnable. But for Biden, it was about his legacy. And if Kamala Harris had won the election by being radically different from, as different radically as Kamala Harris can be, this is not a radical we're talking about, but if she had actually won the election by going against many of Joe Biden's policies and by moving more to the left, like center left as compared to center right as Joe Biden is, and Kamala Harris also eschewed Donald Trump, that could have been a different thing going on there. But it was kneecapped because what was more important to the Democratic Party, what was more important to Joe Biden, the leader of the Democratic Party at that time, was maintaining a legacy. And if Kamala Harris had won by, shooting away Joe Biden's legacy, it would have just been infeasible for Joe Biden to accept the fact that his policies, his ideas were not popular, and they were so unpopular that you needed another person to come in to the rescue at the end. I don't think that would have been how history wrote the story. I think Joe Biden would have been looked at decently favorably if he knew way earlier than the last minute to step aside and let someone new take the floor. I think it would have been even better if there were a proper primary process, because I'm not sure if Harris was the strongest candidate through all of that. But this goes to the larger point I'm saying. And just to reintroduce myself, hi, I'm Dan from the internet. This is my relatively newish series, DTour, where I break down politics in a quicker way than I usually do. And I've seen this dynamic between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and pretty much everyone within the Democratic Party since 2016. I recall this time when I was very fresh and very naive within college, and I had a very passing relationship with my college's Democratic Party club, basically. Many of the colleges, especially ones that have political science programs, filter college students to the party, will have these things. And one way the party will kind of ingratiate younger folks is to invite them to their conventions. If you think the White House Correspondents' Dinner is Hollywood for ugly people, this is somehow more pathetic. You get a bunch of college students and you're supposed to be wooed by access to being close to politicians. I had photos with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and even though it's pretty clear where my loyalties lied within the Democratic Party in 2016, it still had to be said that the amount of access, the amount of proximity that was being given to these people who were young Democrats, you were being slowly ingratiated in how the party worked. You start at the bottom, you make your connections, you network, you be at the right place at the right time, you wait your turn, and eventually it'll be your turn to be this person's chief of staff or this person's attorney general, and you'll get a chance to run in this office. Again, it's careerism. It's false meritocracy. In fact, there is very little meritocracy that I've seen in the Democratic Party up closely. Yes, many of the people who get to the top have degrees and they have backgrounds and they've done things that are objectively smart compared to the Republican politician, which it seems to be all you need is to have a podcast or like an audience on of some kind on social media, and you can probably be a Republican politician. But no, electoral prowess, electoral ability, your ability to meet with constituents and not just seek out their money, but seek out what they need and how they want their communities to be better, and then actually work to deliver that for them. That sort of politics isn't really rewarded in the Democratic Party. And I think when I was there in 2016, I was realizing that, and it was leaving a bad taste in my mouth, as if being a Bernie supporter at that time already didn't leave a bad taste in my mouth, the Democratic Party. And I've only seen that happen consistently with a bunch of Democratic Party politicians who seem to be leveled up to this era of being one of the quote-unquote frontrunners. I remember when Gretchen Whitmer and Gavin Newsom were talked about as some of the favorites to run in 2028. Now I think they're the least favorites, and I don't think I can predict how 2028 or even 2027 or 2026 is going to go from this vantage point in May 2025. But I know a loser when I see one, and these are losers. But again, tenure in the Democratic Party is respected so much more than your actual political ability and what you can do to serve people. If you can get more grassroots support, that may not matter much to the Democratic Party if you can get people to fund your campaign. They're looking for people who can raise money, not necessarily succeed politically for their constituents, which is total perverse incentives if I've ever seen them before. We fully fast forward to 2025, and there's a growing idea within the Democratic Party base that the old guard is not working. And this isn't fully clear. Now, events like Cory Booker, who is essentially an establishment party line Democrat, giving a filibuster that was not necessarily a filibuster, that was more symbolic than anything, there were a lot of, base level Democrats who aren't as in the democratic socialist left as I am, or a Bernie Sanders or an AOC might be. But it was enough of a contrast between Cory Booker and Hakeem Jeffries or Chuck Schumer or any of these other older strategists who have been grifting around the Democratic Party for decades on end, when they've been telling people to stand back and don't fight for the biggest assault on American rights in modern history coming from the Trump administration, when you're seeing American citizens and people with legal status in the United States being deported for as little as how they look or if they what their last name is, or even as little as how they've used their First Amendment free speech rights. It seems like most people in the base, even moderate liberal types, don't see this as a time to do nothing. The hands-off protests, the anti-Elon Musk and Tesla protests, the Stop Oligarchy tour, the grassroots energy is rising and building. And David Hogg, one of the survivors of the Parkland shooting in Florida, has become the vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. And he has started with a warpath. He's been saying that we are going to primary Democrats who are not doing enough for the party, who are not doing enough for the country. And I stand by it. This has ruffled a lot of feathers, and frankly, the right feathers, from incumbents who have stood in the way of change. The Wall Street Journal recently published a piece on older Democrats who are unwilling to step aside. Quoting from Mediaite here, although Clyburn quit as House Democratic whip in 2023, he still wields influence in the caucus, as do former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and former Democratic leader Steny Hoyer, who also stepped down from their leadership positions but still retained their seats. Now, Jim Clyburn was one of the reason, and James Clyburn not liking Bernie Sanders, feeling that he wasn't a true Democrat, making up things like, oh, Bernie Sanders isn't going to work with Black people, as though I or anyone in America who is not in South Carolina ever got an opportunity to even say whether or not James Clyburn speaks for the Black culture. I don't even think South Carolina voters voted for that, all right? Nevertheless, James Clyburn made himself a gatekeeper and helped to be part of the establishment push that stopped Bernie Sanders' momentum in the 2020 primaries. Because folks will remember, the Iowa caucuses were pretty messy. It looked like either Pete Buttigieg or Bernie Sanders was winning. And Pete Buttigieg allegedly had some shady dealings with the way the votes were being counted. Then going to New Hampshire, where Bernie did really well, Nevada, where Bernie did really well. And then it was in South Carolina, which was said to be a test of Bernie Sanders' experience with the Black base of the Democratic Party, which was always going to be hard for reasons that the Black establishment within the Democratic Party had already picked their favorite white people. And their favorite white people are the careerists, the ones who had waited their turn, the ones who had bent the knee and given the proper amount of respect to these elected officials for doing, I can't tell, at least in the modern era. But Clyburn said that Nancy left her seat in leadership, Steny left his seat, I left my seat. What the hell am I supposed to do now? What do you want? Me to give up on my life? Selfishness, careerism. This is not about any politician's life. I've said this before and I'll say it again, especially in the context of the 2020 primary. No politician deserves anything. The idea is that Democrats get in their head from as young as college age, where they're supposed to be docile and, grateful that the Democratic Party gives them the time of day. It's not the way that we should be interacting with politicians. The idea that we want politicians' autographs and we want to take photos with them because we treat them as celebrities is not the healthiest way to deal with politics. Lately, when I've been talking to political figures, maybe I'll get a selfie just for social media, but my conversation with them is about what they need to be doing. More recently, I talked to Robert Garcia, a congressperson from the Los Angeles County area, who took a pretty hard line approach towards Elon Musk and Donald Trump very early on in the second Trump administration, to the point where I knew from the sidelines that there were going to be some Democrats internally who were going to tell him and others like Jasmine Crockett and AOC and anyone else who's been standing up to Donald Trump in the second term, when you need to be doing that. I knew that Robert Garcia was one of the legislators who had been taken in to a private room and meeting with Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, being told to cool it and not seem too partisan. What I asked one of our representatives to do was to ignore his party and fight harder. Luckily, that is largely what Robert Garcia has been doing. That's a relation we should all have with our politics. David Hogg gets this, and because of his efforts to say, we're going to devote money and resources to primary incumbent Democrats. We want to make sure that if you're in your seat and you're not doing enough for your constituents, then you can make room for a Democrat who will stand up for those constituents, who will abide to modern values of what millennials, Gen X, Gen Z are looking for from the Democratic Party and from politicians more broadly. David Hogg gets this and sees a lot of the smoke coming his way too from people like Steny Hoyer. And that's why this piece from Bill Maher, I don't love to make a habit of sharing Bill Maher very often, but this was pretty fascinating interaction here.
There have been a few members that have come out that have said, well, you know, if I retire, my life is effectively over. And what I would say is get over yourself. This isn't about you. This is about our country, and it's about your constituents. Nobody is I don't care if you've been there for decades or just one term. That seat is not yours. It is your constituents. That is who you're there to serve. And if they choose to serve somebody else, so be it. That's all we're trying to do with Leaders We Deserve is give people the option to vote for somebody that isn't necessarily the same person that's been there forever.
Bill, let me just...
David Hogg's exactly right. And they are punishing him for it. You already knew this was coming when Bakari Sellers posted this on X, Twitter. I like David Hogg. Don't know David, but the audacity to tell Clyburn to get over himself is wild. And this is coming from Bakari Sellers, who was a former South Carolina House of Representatives rep, so a state legislature from South Carolina. Bakari Sellers is one of these black faces in high places, sort of black liberal. The idea that as long as we're in the room, as long as you have a Barack Obama and a Kamala Harris, then black people, we're doing all right. We're actually making progress. We're moving forward. Making it clear that, yeah, you can also have black conservatives. And just because they are black conservatives in rooms of importance does not necessarily mean that's going to be good for my material conditions as a black person, as a queer person, as a young person, any of these different things. So, but Bakari Sellers, he's an insider. He's played his thing. He's played his game as he's supposed to be. And so he is representative of what a lot of people were saying internally. And now you have this story where the DNC is moving to try to oust David Hogg because he said his party wasn't standing up to Trump. Because he said that if you are an incumbent who has been in office for decades and you are falling behind what the base of the party wants, not just the base in your state, although I'm sure that's also the case too, but the base across the country, and that fealty to the base, that fealty to Joe Biden, mind you, Jim Clyburn opened up the floodgates for Joe Biden to have a comeback in the primaries, to build that momentum that he got going into Super Tuesday, along with an endorsement from Pete Buttigieg, Beto O'Rourke, Amy Klobuchar, and a bunch of other top-level Democrats who had visible names in the party at that time. They knew when to kiss the ring, and they got benefited for it. You know who didn't get benefits for kissing the ring? The American people. Because any individual within the party who bucks the party slightly, I mean, you can even look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has been rightfully criticized for towing the party line within the Democratic Party for a while. I think my balance to that, my counter argument to that, having been inside the Democratic Party, seeing how it works, seeing how it's a brown-nosing, ass-kissing sort of enterprise that doesn't really care about your political bona fides. It only cares about your fundraising abilities. I like to think that AOC learned this fact quickly about the Democratic Party and was able to realize, okay, there's a balance in between playing this inside-outside game while work within them on the inside to see what power I can get from one of the only two viable parties in this corrupt system. And then I'll work from the outside because everyone who's not directly working for these two parties understands the system is fundamentally broken and wants to change it and improve it for regular, everyday constituents and voters, not just the ones who happen to have money. And I think AOC has kind of crashed out and realized at this point when you got geriatric Connolly, who's going to be a ranking member on the House Oversight Committee. He was given that position over Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, even though he is one of the oldest people in Senate. He's a Democrat from Virginia. He's 74 years old at the time when he was introduced to the seat in late 2024, early 2025. He was just recovering from throat cancer. He has now had to step down again because of that same esophageal cancer like problem. And I don't wish anything wrong to happen to him, but if your job in the House is oversight and you're going to be pointing out corruption, and the answer to that is to eschew Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's effectively the best communicator in the Democratic Party right now, to eschew that for Gerry Connolly, who's also taking this wait and see, well, I don't know what, oh, isn't it weird? Republicans be crazy sometimes. Well, that's definitely bad, but you know what? It's unconstitutional, and we'll see them in court. Like, it's not enough to just do that. You have to have a rhetorical game plan to show every single way the Republicans are actively hostile to all constituencies in this country. Even Republican constituencies in this country, because that's very easy to do. Someone who understands social media, someone who understands getting messages out across multiple mediums, not just cable news and TV and the press, which is fundamentally too easy to do, but social media, the internet, TikTok, Twitch, YouTube. You have to be able to do all of these different things to be able to succeed. AOC can do that, and she realized the Democratic Party wouldn't give her that position because, again, it's a careerism, seniority thing over who's going to actually win. And so, yeah, the Democratic Party is fundamentally allergic to winning. And I think we're kind of stuck here because, yes, the move is to start a new party. But the two-party system has been entrenched in this country for almost the existence of the Constitution. You had the first couple of presidents and founding fathers who were like, political parties, this is going to end badly. George Washington was not part of a political party. John Adams, the second president, because the writing was on the wall, he eventually aligned himself to a political party. And most presidents since then have run for office in two-party, if they're lucky, three-party systems, until you get to the Civil War, when the Whig Party just ultimately fully dies out, and you just have the Democrats and the Republicans. And since then, since the 1860s, so for more than 150 years, we have been in this cycle of, oh, well, there's two sides to every story. There's one side, well, let's see what the other side thinks. And there has been this erasure of the idea that Americans actually don't like either party. Of course, the elites in both parties love the idea that we have, in America, reduced our body politic to two sides and two sides only. Because I think if we lived in a parliamentary system where you had five sides potentially representing the public, you'd get a much better representation of what people want. And people might actually feel like, oh, if I vote for this, it might have a chance of passing. There might be a reason to actually go to the ballot box this time, instead of wasting my vote on a party I know is either going to slow the bleeding or get the bleeding over with, so we just go to whatever happens after this. The two-party system has got us stuck in an inevitability where decline is inevitable. At the same time, because of those historical pieces I told you about, it's going to be very difficult for us to get rid of the two-party system in the 18 months we need for the midterms, or the 3 years that we need for the 2028 elections, right? But I will end this video with how I am planning to look at this, because inevitably there will be candidates I like who will be saying the right things, who will be speaking the right things, but will inevitably run as Democrats, knowing that that is the easiest way they can win in office. Similarly, there will be people running in conservative districts who run as independents, who probably on paper would be more in line with the Democrats or even the leftists, the socialists, if you want to say that. I think my fundamental base layer is I need to understand whether it's in their policy or in their rhetoric, preferably both, but also ideally some of their history and their background being far away from the political process and more closer towards grassroots organizing and activism and actually getting things done on a local level, whether you're working with two parties or whether you're going around the two or more parties in your area. I think I want to see that. I know, as we've seen from David Hogg, as we've seen from AOC and Bernie Sanders, if you cross the Democratic Party, they hate the disrespect more than they hate losing. They hate being disrespected, the Democratic Party. They hate being disrespected more than they hate seeing your rights being taken away. That's what we've seen, just like flat out. That's what I've seen over the past 10 years of my political sentience with the Democratic Party, 15 years paying attention to politics before that. And when you look at the history, when you look at people who've been looking at this longer than I have, the writing is super on the wall. Democrats hate being disrespected more than they hate seeing the country be robbed and looted by the Republicans and their billionaire crypto-fash libertarian buddies. We as people need to understand how these systems exist, how hard it'll be to take apart the Democratic Party just from the inside, how hard it'll be just to take it apart from the outside, and why you need an inside-outside strategy to do that. And why we also have to be very careful, not just to back the people that we can trust who are walking the walk and talking the talk, but also keeping those people accountable so that they don't perpetuate the same buddy system, the same kickback system that the elder Democrats have put in place since, frankly, the civil rights movement and a little bit afterwards. So yeah, it's more complicated than the Democrats aren't a good option, so let's just go with the Republicans, or let's just meet in the middle because we hate the Democratic Party. We need to have both an understanding of the realities of the situation, that we will need some skeleton of the Democratic Party to get out of this mess, because they have the 50-state infrastructure, they have the offices, they have the name recognition, but we need people within the party and a new ethos, a new direction within the party that makes it so if you try to hide from other people within that party, the mental or physical or whatever other conditions that sabotage the party, the country, people's rights, that you are not allowed to be in an environment where everyone will be hush-hush with you, because everyone understands that protecting a small club of people's jobs is more important than the rights of 350 million people in this country. So now we write at dawn for David Hogg, we write at dawn for Bernie Sanders, we write at dawn for anyone on the left willing to speak out against the party itself, and we will accept nothing less. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, share, do all the different things that show that you want more of these videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.